The BBC loves to claim that it's independent. But what if I told you, as we speak, they are taking millions from multiple governments, including the United States and the European Union? The BBC generally takes its money and funding from those who pay their TV license fee. But why is it also receiving a lot of money, not just from the USAID, but also the UK Foreign Office and the European Commission? Now, firstly, on the issue of the UK Foreign Office, that confirms everything that we always say. It doesn't matter if you even cancel your license fee, you are still funding the BBC because the central government in Westminster still gives money directly to the organization. So it's not just through the TV license fee. But everything goes back to the concept of being independent, where it clearly relies on multiple governments and many other organizations to fund it and to essentially have a say and control it. Then that is a main question which we are going to be unpacking. Now, firstly, what is BBC Media Action? Who is funding it? And also, the main point is, what does this actually mean when it comes to BBC's editorial independence? Is the BBC just yet another state-controlled media outlet? BBC Media Action is a charity linked to the BBC that supposedly works on global developments and media projects. In 2023 and 2024, it received $3.3 million from USAID, that's a US government agency known for influencing foreign media, $3.8 million from the UK Foreign Office, don't know why, but also $1.7 million from the European Commission. Despite this, the BBC still claims that it is independent. Now, one main worry is that when we talk about the European Union, it's not necessarily even the European Parliament, which is technically the democratic side of the European Union. Now, obviously, European Parliament itself is a plastic parliament, it's a fake parliament, but it's not European Parliament. It's not the European Union in general as a European project. No, it's the European Commission, the dictatorship of Brussels, the entity that you, as the people of Europe, you have absolutely no say in who runs it and who's the commissioner and how they conduct business. Now, going back to USAID, is this a soft power tool? Because as a US agency for international development, it does have a history of funding media operations in foreign countries. It's been involved in regime change efforts, media manipulation, and funding opposition groups. Why would the BBC accept money from an agency that works to advance US foreign policy? Does this influence how the BBC reports on US foreign policy, global conflicts, or elections? For example, we've seen over the last year or so, when Joe Biden was in the White House, the BBC's editorial stance on the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Considering that the Biden administration were not really friendly towards Israel, somehow at the same time, the BBC's coverage was also pretty much against Israel. Now, when it comes to the UK Foreign Office and the European Commission, again, there are strings attached. The UK Foreign Office and the EU funding BBC Media Action raises so many questions. The BBC is clearly being used as a government propaganda tool rather than an independent news outlet. How does this funding affect its coverage on things like Brexit, foreign policy in general, and EU relationship? Now, we know that civil servants as part of the Foreign Office in Westminster have been exposed, have been biased, for example, against Brexit, against the patriots, those who believe in sovereignty and self-determination. The Foreign Office continues to have influence when it comes to other things across the world, and the BBC never seems to question it. Is that why? But my favorite part of the whole saga is the hypocrisy of the BBC. Yeah, as an organization, they frequently attack other media outlets as state-controlled. That includes, obviously, RT, CGTN, Al Jazeera. And by the way, they have a point because they are controlled by the state of Qatar and Russia and all the others. So that's true. But what about them? Because they are clearly taking money also from multiple governments, not just one government. And at least, for example, certain state media outlets like Al Jazeera and some others as well, they primarily take the money from their own government, not foreign actors. Now, I personally think it's time for the BBC to be labelled across social media platforms, specifically on X, as a state media organisation. I do believe that Elon Musk and X do classify them as a state media outlet anyway, but it has to be clarified because transparency is important. Now, again, this whole thing relies on two main factors. Number one is about the funding, because there's clearly an illusion that they've created that only those who watch the BBC, or they say watch live TV, pay the license fee and they are responsible for funding the BBC. They make it sound like Netflix, that you choose voluntarily. If you watch live TV, then you have to pay. But it's not true, because as I said, even if you cancel your license fee, you are still funding the BBC. That's one issue, apart from the fact that people from across the world, different countries, taxpayers in Germany and France and other places, they are also funding the BBC. But that's only the first factor. The second factor goes back to the concept of coverage. Now, they claim to be the fact checkers. They claim to be the senior, morally high in terms of the referee in this world, in this crazy world that we have. You can only trust the BBC as a source, and also as an analyst. They fact check everybody else, but who fact checks their fact checkers? Who holds the BBC to account? Clearly, it's not just a media outlet, it's a propaganda machine, and this is not supposed to be some breaking news, shocking surprise. You already know that, but the details are important. Now, a lot of people are asking, how are they taking all this money without actually knowing what they're going to do with it? What do they actually spend the money on? Do you really need an empire of studio, an army of producers and everything else to run a media outlet, even a professional outlet? You clearly don't in 2025. But here's a list of things that they spend money on. Now, when it comes to their television content, in 2022 and 2023, the BBC allocated £1.9 billion to that section, accounting for 61% of its total content expenditure. When it comes to radio and world service, well, that gets crazy. Radio services get £498 million, and the BBC World Service gets £352 million. And of course, they have notable expenditures when it comes to major events, including the FIFA World Cup, anything about the coronations, jubilees, and all the other football events and other big criteria. Now, the problem of accountability also goes back to a more moral level, because they have so many controversies, so many scandals, and at times criminal, and it always gets exposed. Nothing ever happens to the BBC. Or you had the situation with Hugh Edwards only recently, the main presenter of the BBC, who was basically caught being extremely inappropriate, and the court case exposed it, yet the BBC didn't take any responsibility for the hiring. The same goes with Jimmy Savile. The BBC's toxic relationship with Jimmy Savile, and of course all the other scandals around it that went decades, and it was completely uncovered. And we also have other controversies and scandals, which again goes back to the culture at the BBC. For example, Martin Bashir's interview with Princess Diana. That actually led to a massive crisis, because they had to have an investigation which found that Martin Bashir used deceitful methods to secure a 1995 interview with Princess Diana. And of course, let's not forget about Gary Lineker and his suspension in 2023, because he didn't know that he's not supposed to be political, at the same time trying to pretend to be an impartial BBC presenter. Now, the BBC claim to be the gods of morality, but obviously the way they are receiving money, the way they are spending the money, and the way they are handling controversies and scandals clearly should raise a lot of questions, not just for those who still pay the license fee, but the British taxpayers, because their money still goes to the organization. But also, if you're watching this from across the world, whether you're watching it from the US, Europe, or elsewhere, I think it's time for you guys to also ask questions. Why is your money being sent to the BBC?